I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Helen Joyce. She's a journalist, mathematician, women's rights advocate, and author of Trans: When Ideology Meets Reality. Helen, welcome to the Nature Nurture podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
But before we get into all of the gender theory, it stuck out to me that you trained as a mathematician, but you've been working as a journalist for 20 plus years. I'm really interested to learn about your former life as a mathematician and how this career switch happened.
Sure, but it wasn't actually my first career switch. What I wanted to be when I was a little girl was a ballet dancer. So I left school at 16 and went off to dancing school in England. And I was there for 2 years out of a 3-year course. I qualified as a teacher of dance in that time, but decided that I wasn't ever going to make it as a dancer, which was a correct decision. And then I had the decision of what to do next. And the thing I'd liked best at school was mathematics. So I put in a late application to do maths at Trinity College Dublin. I'd missed the deadline. So the way things work in Ireland is you put in a single application for all the universities and colleges, and I'd missed the deadline for that. So I was allowed to put in just one application for one course in one university, and I knew I wouldn't be considered until the second round. And in fact, the course filled on the first round, so I didn't know what to do, really. But luckily, somebody dropped out, and they phoned me after term had started and said, did I still want that place? So I started my maths degree in 1987 in Trinity College Dublin. And I loved it. People who do mathematics in school and like it often like doing sums, because there's a sort of a personality type that just enjoys working things out and like doing the same sum, different examples of it lots of times, or solving equations. And then they go to university and it's all quite theoretical and you're not using numbers anymore. You're mostly doing letters. And it turns out that some people who like maths don't actually like real maths, and other people do. And I did. So what I liked was very pure mathematics, and I decided I wanted to be an academic. So I did master's in Cambridge, and then I went to UCL, University College London, and did a PhD in a deeply theoretical area. The central result of my thesis was about a counterexample in infinite dimensional space to something that nobody actually really used, because it was an alternative to something that was much more used.
Mm-hmm.
But it did, I mean, I learned a lot from doing it, and I loved doing it, and I intended to be an academic. But the two things that sort of stood me in good stead from that are, one, a sort of an intellectual confidence. It's not easy for somebody to say, I'm too stupid to understand something complex, because I have a PhD in pure mathematics, so I sort of feel they're probably wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one is I can spot a circular definition at 1,000 paces, which became very useful when people started saying trans women are women. So yeah, I then did 3 years of postdoc. So I spent 11 years in total pursuing the idea of being an academic mathematician. And the postdoc didn't go great. I was bored. I was lonely. I wasn't getting anywhere. Like pure maths, you don't get results all the time. And when you're not getting results, you're not doing anything. Like you're just trying to write things and it's not working. So you have to have a certain personality type to cope with that. You either have to be incredibly productive, like a really unusually good, or else just someone who can really cope with day after day getting nowhere. And I wasn't that person. And so I decided to drop out of it. And what precipitated that, which was a very difficult decision, I was living in central Finland at the time, because that's where I was doing my postdoc. What precipitated that was my brother-in-law was killed in an accident, and he was 35 at the time. He had been a pediatrician, and he was walking in New Zealand where he lived. He was walking on Mount Cook, and a crevasse opened up and he fell down it and was suffocated by the snow that fell on top of him. And I later discovered that when people are suddenly bereaved, they often make big changes to their own lives, because it makes you think, life is short and it could end any day. And the thing about Mark is he had been very happy. It had taken him a long time to become a pediatrician. He hadn't actually got access to medicine at first. He'd had to do a biochemistry degree. He was bad at exams. He had worked so hard to get where he was going. And he was finally doing the thing that he loved, and he was so good at it. And I just thought, like, oh, if I died tomorrow, I'm bored. I'm getting nowhere. I'm achieving nothing. And I walked out. I had a job lined up back in Ireland, another postdoc, and I just turned it down. Went back, my husband and I went back and stayed with his parents because that was his only sibling. And I have 8 siblings. So I sort of felt my parents could do without me for a bit. And then I ended up doing some work back at UCL on public understanding of mathematics. And then I saw a job advertised in the math department in Cambridge. This was just coming up to the millennium, like coming up to the year 2000. And it was for a new institute that was going to do public understanding of mathematics. Still exists, the Millennium Maths Project. And they were looking for people to work there. And I just thought, like, wow, that's something I'd be good at. I love explaining mathematics to people. I'm enthusiastic about mathematics. And so I worked there for several years. And during that time, I started working also for the Royal Statistical Society, editing a magazine for them, again, about public understanding, about applications of statistics, why statistics matters, why it's exciting. And I enjoyed both those jobs very much. And then one day I saw an ad for a job at The Economist, which I was a subscriber to. And it just said, if you'd like to work for us, send us a CV, what you call a resume, and also a sample article, an original article that could be published in The Economist. And I thought that I might get some freelance work writing about official statistics or similar. And so I wrote them an article about the polling for the election in 2005, because this was in 2005. The closing date was just the day after the general election. And I wrote 2 versions of this article, one if the polls were accurate and one if they weren't. And woke up on the Friday morning to see which it was and sent them the right one. And to my great surprise, they offered me a job. And it was awful timing, really awful timing. I was just lined up to do IVF for the 3rd time. And I paid and I bought the drugs and everything. I already had a child by IVF. And I just thought, like, if this works, I'll be starting work pregnant in a new place and I won't have maternity rights. And it did work. And I did start pregnant and I didn't have maternity rights. But, those sort of opportunities come once in a lifetime. And so I started work at The Economist it was 2005, yes. And I had my 2nd child in 2006. And I worked there for 17 years and was very happy and expected to work there for the rest of my life until I discovered the trans issue.
Mhm. Wow. There's so much to unpack there. And I can also see some of the seeds in it. Like, for one, what you said about intellectual confidence in the book and in your other writings, you have this uniquely systematic way of approaching the issues. And I thought that couldn't be a coincidence. I see what you mean, that the identifying circular definitions or the logical search space, how your math background definitely would have helped with that.
And also the writing style at The Economist, because you don't have bylines at The Economist. It was founded in 1843, and back then nobody put bylines. Nobody said who the author of pieces was. You just published them from the newspaper. And The Economist has always been a very small c conservative publication. I mean, at times also big C conservative. But what I mean is it's slow to change. If things work, it's slow to change. And in fact, it has remained anonymous apart from the big articles. So the only 2 things that I've ever written in The Economist that have my name on them are 2 special reports, one about Brazil when I was a foreign correspondent and one about banking when I was finance editor. Apart from that, everything I wrote, hundreds of articles, doesn't have my name on it. And so the paper doesn't employ sub-editors as other newspapers do. They're the people who screw up your copy, basically. The people who take what you wrote, try to make it more sexy and comprehensible, and in the process introduce many, many errors. I exaggerate slightly, but this is how it feels being sub-edited. It's all done internally by the people who commission the articles, and you see everything before it gets published. It's very collaborative. And there's always a lot of pressure on space because, it's a certain length newspaper, it's weekly, it covers the world, very wide range of topics. So you learn to write things in an extremely concise and very logical way that I think everyone I know at The Economist who's written a book says that it was an amazing tutorial, in effect, in how to write. And I now actually teach writing, and I learned a lot from both the process of being edited there and of editing other people's work for the last decade I wrote there.
I'm wondering if there were also seeds of your interest in the gender debate, where at least historically, and I think still, STEM departments are overwhelmingly male. So you might have been one of the only women in your program. Did that shape your views on gender? And maybe you have it's
It
it's
is.
sensitive to say this because of the culture. I think you're probably the best person I could say such a thing to, but like stereotypically, would you say your personality is more masculine, being involved in like
Mm,
this contentious issue, being so good at debating, even just being interested in math more than more feminine career topics?
mm. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I always regarded myself as a feminist in that very straightforward way of I think women are as good as men and as important as men, and I don't approve of structural oppression of one group of people by another in the way that there has been right through human history. Um, Maybe as a teenager, I might have been more willing to overlook genuine differences between the sexes. I can't really remember, I'm not somebody who thinks about the past really at all. So I can't remember as a teenager if somebody had said to me, men are on average better at maths than women, would I have agreed or disagreed? Because I mean, that is just a fact. Um, there are more men with high performance in the sorts of things that we know correlate with high mathematics performance. And in particular, there are more men who are interested in mathematics than are
Hmm.
interested in women. I didn't really think about that very much. I did wonder when I stopped wanting to do it. What I said to you was that I was bored and lonely. Um, I am more sociable than many men are, and in particular, many men in mathematics. I like teaching. I'm quite an introverted person, although that doesn't come across. I'm introverted but not shy. But
Me
I'm
too.
interested in people, and I like people. I like connecting with people. I like teaching. Um, and I was lonely. So so I think if I do a personality test, I come out as, some things are quite male typical. For example, I don't score highly on agreeableness, which is one of the big differences between men and women. I think might be the biggest, in fact.
Hmm.
It doesn't bother me that people disagree with me. This comes across as arrogance sometimes, but I don't necessarily think that I'm right and they're wrong. I'm just saying I don't change what I think or say because other people are disagreeing with me. Obviously, liking mathematics is a male typical thing to like. But I don't like chess, and I'm totally uninterested in bloody rockets going up to Mars or anything like that. My husband loves this stuff, and I have two sons, and I'm married to a man. And have I ever been tempted to join in bloody Dungeons and Dragons or any of those computer games, or Warhammer 40K, or Games Workshop, or chess? All of these things are beyond tedious as far as I'm concerned.
Hmm.
So what I like about mathematics is the sort of philosophical side about it. I like the endless beauty of things that are eternally true. I like theorems.
Hmm.
Um, I don't have neither of my children is mathematical, although they were both very good at it. They both chose to do other things. What else about me is masculine and feminine? Well, I love babies, but then all my brothers love babies too. I mean, I'm one of 9 kids, and there are 22 kids of the next generation. Sorry, 23, I think now. And we all love babies. So what's cause and effect there? I'm not sure.
Right.
I'm the eldest, and there've always been babies around. I always knew I wanted to be a mother. I think people see long hair and they think you're feminine, but I'm the one who moved us out to Brazil. I was the one who got the visa, and my husband came as a dependent because there was no other option on a journalist visa. So I think I'm very gender nonconforming in some ways. Like it's
Hmm.
quite gender nonconforming to tell men to shovel, like to just say no to men when men want things. It's the most
Right.
feminine coded thing there is women providing emotional services to men who don't even notice that they're being
Hmm.
provided. So when I say that no, this space is for women only, I know it makes you unhappy because you're a man who thinks that you're a woman. That's not my problem, it's your problem. That's actually a very masculine thing to say.
Hmm.
And it provokes great rage among men, including the men who aren't identifying as women, by the way. Men find women saying no to men really deeply outraging. So yeah, that was a long answer to a short question. I think, like everybody, I'm a mixture of male and female, coded or typical things, and that's one of my very male typical traits.
Right. So this is a working hypothesis for me because when I've reflected on my own interest in sex research, I think in retrospect, a lot of it might come from being more gender non-stereotypical, not particularly fitting in. Even in my program now, developmental psychology is overwhelmingly female. So I'm one of the only males interested in this. Even before I got interested in gender dysphoria, I was interested in child development, was one of the kids that, like many girls that I spoke to, they've always fantasized about motherhood. I've always fantasized about being a father. But I ask guys my age, many of them aren't even thinking about it. Increasingly, women aren't even thinking about it. So I think maybe it's growing up uh, with in more of a traditional background and then experiencing this sort of culture shock in university and then just being interested in
Yes.
that. And it makes me wonder
Yes.
if other people in our space, if we all have our unique ways in which maybe the gender thing was an interesting puzzle, not just you follow whatever the mainstream is.
I think that's probably true, but I don't think it's true of me. Um, I mean, it's a fact that a large number of sexologists are gay men, for example, who were often very gender non-conforming as children. And it's also a fact that in the space where I am now, a very disproportionate number of the women are lesbians who are also very gender non-conforming. And then, we often joke among myself, my colleagues, and my friends, and the people that I work with frequently in other organizations, we're all disagreeable women. Um, like we all get on great, except for the occasional bits of tension that we work through. But, we're all people who have a healthy ego and who think that our way of doing things is right and have to be persuaded. So in that sense, we're very atypical. I have to say, I'm not someone who's ever worried about being a woman in a man's job or a woman in a man's place. And, I can tell you sexist things that happened when I was an undergraduate for sure. I was an undergraduate in 1987 to 1991, and it was still completely acceptable for the entirely male, like every single lecturer in my department was male, and some of them real arses. Um, but I don't know why. I've just never thought it's very helpful to worry about those things or give them any thought. And I can be a very oblivious person too, so I don't spend much time worrying about what other people think or feel. So it hasn't been the case that I've been thinking, oh, I'm so atypical. Why is that? I mean, young gay people I know do think that. I think there's a standard kink in the developmental pathway of gay teenagers, which is, I'm atypical. Why is that? Oh, this might be why. And then it's an extra bend in the road to adulthood for them. I can't say I had that at all. I just
Hmm.
thought, like, I want to be a ballet dancer. Oh, that hasn't worked out. Okay, then I want to be a mathematician, without ever stopping and thinking, gosh, isn't that a very unusual set of
Hmm.
two things to want to be, which it is. But, there we go.
Yeah, it seems like any individual is always better off when they don't ruminate and victimize themselves, and yet it's become increasingly common, probably more so in my generation. I wonder if part of that is a selection effect, at least within academia, because typically in the admissions essays, you're writing about difficult circumstances you've overcome, although that could also turn into just writing about difficult
Whining.
circumstances generally. Yeah, whining.
Yeah, whining, basically. No, it's definitely not a selection effect because there's no such requirement in British universities. You don't write entrance essays. It's just not how it works. I mean, you get an interview at some of the fanciest universities like Oxford or Cambridge, but by and large, you don't even have a chance to tell people about the adversity you've overcome. And yet we are still seeing the same mental health crisis among teenagers here. For years, I'm skeptical about things that say things are worse now than they used to be, or there's a crisis of this, that, and the other. There is absolutely, definitely a mental health crisis among teenagers now. As somebody who has two young adult children, and they were both very well, but I watched what it was like at school. I mean, it's just extraordinary the extent to which children are now encouraged to ruminate, like all
Mhm.
these wellness days and questionnaires that you're meant to fill in, like, how often do you think about this, that, and the other? And I would say it was much worse for my second child than for my first. There's 5 years between the two of them. By the time he was in sixth form, which is when you're 17, 18, it was so common that there was these mental health days and these questionnaires sent home about all the awful things that had happened to you and so on, that I would say to them, don't even read them. Just tick at random with your eyes closed if you can possibly manage it, and just put it back in. Don't put these ideas into your head. And yet, very large numbers of the women of my age who have kids, those kids are anxious, depressed, have ADHD, diagnoses that are not helping. You know, if these things were helping, it'd be one thing. If you realized that you were atypical because you're on the autism spectrum or you have ADHD, and we knew what to do about that to help you to achieve despite it. But it seems mostly to be a reason for expecting less of you. Other people expect less of you, you expect less of you. And then that feeds through and has fed through in universities. I mean, there's hard evidence of this. This isn't me, just hypothesizing here. Some of it's in hard numbers, like the number of kids who do have diagnoses of various sorts of vague mental health issues at university and who get extra time for exams. These things are quadrupled and quintupled in a decade. But also when I talk to friends who are lecturers, they tell me that, the first time somebody asks for an extension, they give it to them. They automatically give it, and they're told off if they don't. They are told that they must rearrange essays and so on so that they don't clash with other things that the student has to do. Large proportions of the kids get extra time or have to be allowed to sit in a different place to do their exams because they're not good at coping with, noise or distraction. All these things are the sort of everyday challenge that you were expected to go through in your latter years in school and then university that turns you into an adult. And as somebody who worked with young adults and hired young adults until relatively recently, they're much less prepared than they were because they believe that their boss is something like their mother, that it's their boss's job to smooth the way for them. But we get stronger by coping with moderate challenges. And those moderate challenges have been washed out of the education system almost entirely. And, the result is that we have far weaker mental health among young people.
Mm-hmm. Helen, we met at the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference. You may remember psychologist Erica Komisar's talk. She was talking about motherhood and parenting and this narcissism and mental health epidemic amongst kids. There were also a few talks about demographic changes like the collapsing birth rate. And one of the most interesting perspectives I heard on all of these cultural changes we're talking about and this mental health epidemic and changes in narcissistic entitled kids is that it's not necessarily anything wrong with them or the parents, but it's essentially a natural side effect of the changing demographics that people are having fewer kids, having them when they're older. Older typically also means they're going to be wealthier and maybe have lower energy. Jordan Peterson's talked a lot about this. Like when you're a parent, if you're in your 20s, you have 5 kids, they're all running around. You can't really give them as much attention. You also don't have as many resources compared to what we increasingly see now, especially within academia. Someone who's waiting to have kids till after tenure, they're like 35, they have a whole college fund, maybe they only have one child. They're doing everything they can from the very start to get the child in all these sorts of Head Start curricula. It makes sense to me that those are two dramatically different worlds to grow up in. And it also makes me reflect on my own upbringing. I had a single mom and I was an only child, but single mom who was working all the time, poor family background. I went to university on scholarship and then, go to a private school that has a lot of these wealthy children from 2-parent households going on vacations, had a college fund, all of these things. And I wonder if that's where my peers call me conservative. I don't particularly feel conservative, but with regard to gender norms, work ethic, sense of victimization, if anything, my reasons for victimization might be higher. I'm also Palestinian, so that was interesting to see during the campus protest last year, which I really wasn't very supportive of. Not because it's not an important issue, but because it seemed more like virtue signaling to me. The kids were just making a mess and not going to classes. I didn't see how it was going to contribute. A more sensible way might be to write like what you were doing. Anyway, that's a long tangent, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on how much of this might be due to those demographic changes and the types of environment that you're growing up in.
Yeah, we're in a kind of doom loop about having kids.
Hmm.
Most people do about what their culture expects them to do. Like, you know, the way that China had to force people to have one child, and then you force everyone to have one child for 50 years, and then you say have a second or third, but nobody's having those second or third children. They can't get them to because nobody knows what it's like to have a second or a third child. And I was born in 1968, and my parents married. I think my father was 27 or so. My mother was certainly maybe 21. Um, she had me at 23. And that was completely standard. And the bedrooms, these were 4-bed new houses, an estate, a bit outside central Dublin. Everybody had 3 children minimum. And she said that when people would move to Ireland, and it was only ever from England, like I was 14 before I ever saw somebody who wasn't either Irish or white English. Like I literally, and that was when I went to London for the first time that I flew. Ireland was monocultural beyond belief, but sometimes people would turn up from England and they would usually turn up with 1 or 2 children. And then they would look around and a couple of years later, they'd have a third and then maybe a fourth, because that's what people around them had. We do what our culture, the scripts that our cultures write for us, even those of us who think that we think for ourselves, we all do that. So if your culture thinks that you wait until 35 or later to have kids and that you have 0, 1, or at most 2, then that's all you have. And what you end up with is an awful lot of only children. And, I've had 2 kids, but I've been looking after kids since I'm no exaggeration, since I was 18 months old, because that's what age I was when my baby brother was born, the first of them. I kind of know what I'm doing. It's like, it's not that hard. A lot of it, it's tiring and it's boring, but it's not rocket science. But if you've been an independent human being who's had nobody to look after but yourself, and then somebody lands this squalling character on you that there's no manual for, and you don't know why they're crying, and you're not going to sleep properly for months, and so on, it's unbelievably hard. Why would you do it? The only reason you do it is because everybody does it. And if you've waited until you're 35 or even 40 to do it, like really, why would you do it? Like human beings have had babies because we get pregnant when we have sex. Like that's why. It's not because people have really wanted babies, it's because they've wanted sex. And babies are regarded by your tribe or your group as a blessing in general, you know? So yeah, we've got a lot of people who are very ignorant about how to look after children and who also feel they have to do it all themselves. Like from when I was 4, my mother was pushing me out the door with the younger child and saying, don't come back till tea time. And that was what everybody else was doing with their children too. And all our back gardens joined up. And it was very safe. Ireland was the safest place in the world in terms of the murder rate when I was a child. It's still a very safe place, like literally the lowest murder rate in the world. So you really could just push your kids out and say, come home for dinner. Well, now I can't do that here where I live, even though I live in a nice town. There's no one else outside. Who do they play with? Where are they meant to play? Nobody else is doing that with their kids. So it's become much harder to look after your children at the same time as you're more ignorant about how to do it. I see that as like more important than the issues of, are you having to get them the head start for college applications from when they're 4 or something? It's just that you don't know what you're doing. Like I know so many people who are taking kids with quite easy to solve problems off to see behavioral psychologists or get them diagnosed with, random things, as opposed to just saying, make him run around for 3 hours and that'll stop him from being so annoying. Or, just say, sorry, no, I can't. It's bedtime. I don't care whether you don't like dinner. That's dinner. Don't eat it if you don't want. Just much easier, but also more successful ways of dealing with your child. I mean, I'm not a small c conservative person at all by nature, but people who aren't conservative small c when it comes to children are doing it wrong. Children need boundaries. Children need to be told what's what. They need grown-ups to be in charge. Children don't have a clue. And yet now we have this idea of child-led development, people saying not just about the trans issue, but my child knows best. Your child does not know best. Your child doesn't know jack shit. You're the grown-up. Be a grown-up. But if you've never been a grown-up for other people, how do you know to do that? And no one else around you is doing it. And there's all these people who want to teach you how to, I don't know, make your child eat or sleep or whatever when it's not that complex.
Mm-hmm. You think it's abdication and of responsibility masquerading as compassion?
I think people think it's what they're meant to do and they don't know what else to do and everybody's doing it. I mean, it definitely is abdicating responsibility, but we have a society-wide thing where we think that the children are in charge. Children are very unhappy when they're in charge. Children know that they're vulnerable and they know that they're ignorant. And there's nothing a child likes better than a grown-up who seems calm, in control of the situation, can tell them what's what. And I mean, not in a way that's mean or bullying or anything like that. I don't mean that. I mean, when a grown-up walks into a room where children are kicking off and that grown-up takes control, gets everyone to calm down, every child there is so happy. The grown-up is in charge, and we've got a society-wide problem where the grown-ups have, have abdicated responsibility, and children hate it. Children act up when they're left to run things because they're trying to find where the boundary is. They push to see where, how far is too far to go. I mean, by the way, I think that's one of the reasons behind neo-pronouns. You've got so many kids whose parents would say no to nothing. Like the parents who, wouldn't say no to tattoos, wouldn't say no to piercings, will get their children alcohol or marijuana when they're very young even. And I'm talking about liberal, well-off parents here, parents who think that their own parents were too strict, so that they're going to, everything they think isn't a reasonable restriction. Or, who encourage their children to break uniform code in school because the uniform code is stupid or whatever. That child is going to look to see what they can do before their parents finally say no, because they feel the world is a big, scary, amorphous place and they don't know where the boundaries are. And how incredibly irritating to force your parents to use stupid language for you that's not natural to them. I really think that that's part of the reason for it. So children are just much happier if you say to them, yeah, I don't care whether your uniform rules are stupid. They're the rules in this school. In this house, we're not going against those rules. When you're grown up, you can do what you like I do.
And we're experiencing that type of boundary testing now as a culture, especially with regard to these gender issues.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, it's too late by the time they've come to you at this one. And by the way, just on your own, you can't necessarily fix it. I know parents who are good boundary setters and who have been very sensible about all sorts of things, and their children have still ended up in a bad state because you as a family are quite powerless against very big societal shifts. Like it's like the thing that John Haidt and others say about mobile phones. It's completely different to say to your child, all your friends have mobile phones and they use mobile phones to organize meeting and so on, and you're going to be an outcast because I'm not letting you have a mobile phone. That's a completely different thing to your entire group saying we don't give children mobile phones until 13 or 15 or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to be a boundary setter when other people in your culture, other parents and other teachers are not being boundary setters. I mean, we've got to try, but I'm not saying like, oh, any parent who has ended up in these issues must be a bad parent. I'm not saying that at all.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's just the boundary setting, not even individual level or group level, but even philosophically. You trace this back to postmodernism. Like when people argue, let's say about having kids, so this isn't even related to the transgender debate per se, but you said, okay, the evolutionary instinct is just because everyone's doing it, or even the instinct is to have sex, and we weren't adapted to an environment that has contraception. So if someone asks, like, why not, or why should I? And they point to, well, all sorts of justifications they can give. Some of them point to climate change, overpopulation, whatever the thing is going to be, or even just this individualism, like it's my life. Maybe I don't want to be a caretaker. So we could look at that as a little bit immature, but also it's a sensible philosophy. Like you need to get underneath it. You need to have some sort of objective argument in favor of these traditional values. And it's really hard to do that, maybe impossible outside of just pragmatically.
Yeah, I don't have a good argument for it. I know why I had kids, and that's because I think kids are the nicest thing in the world, and babies in particular are the nicest thing in the world.
Yeah. It's hard for me to understand that a lot of people don't seem to think that.
I know. And I mean, I'm one of a large family in which everybody, male and female, takes that as read, But if, my sister once told me that she was visiting, she's 8 years younger than me. She was visiting my family in Ireland, and a friend of hers was in town at the same time. And we were just all, I don't think I was there on this occasion, but many people were around, and there's just a lot of babies. There've been a lot of babies since the babies started coming up 20 plus years ago. And everybody is just like, oh, he's so beautiful. Let me have a cuddle. Oh, delicious. Look at these chubby little fat thighs. Oh, sweet little pet. Like all the kids are just regarded as not spoiled, it's not that, but just regarded as joyous, beautiful, wonderful things. And she found out afterwards, her friend went home, grown up this is, and said to her mother, "You weren't like that to me. You never said to me how lovely I was and how beautiful I was. And I'm feeling very hard done by that as a result." So if everybody around you thinks that babies are just the bee's knees and then helps you with them as well, then it's easy enough to say, babies are great, I want one. But if nobody's going to be like that, I can't argue for you, you have to have a baby, because it's bloody hard work. And if you don't see that they're beautiful, I can't tell you that they are. Like, most people who have them do end up loving their own baby and do end up seeing the point of them. In particular, there's a thing that men often don't see, that babies are nice until they have their own baby. And their own baby, my God, that baby is like the baby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I can't argue for it. I just always, from when I was tiny, like I remember washing my baby doll in the sink while my mum was washing my little siblings in the bath. I knew I wanted to be a mum from tiny. My husband often quotes this thing that happened. It was when we were in Finland and I was a postdoc. That was when we discovered I wasn't going to be able to have them very easily at all. And I remember sitting there and, I was already very unhappy about my job. And I said to him, I don't want much out of life. I had him, obviously. I was happily married and I'm still married to him. I said, I just want a decent job, somewhere decent to live, and a baby, and I'd give up the rest for the baby. And I've always known that, if I would choose just one thing in my life that I could have, it would be the baby. No question. It wouldn't be work. It would be the baby.
Me too.
Yeah. And that was what kept me going through IVF, actually, this was not an option for me to not try to get the one thing I wanted. But most people don't feel like that. And I can't argue that they should, because they don't. It's a feeling.
So that's where the slippery slope comes in, because even if it might be societally ideal that everyone liked kids, if someone doesn't, you're not going to force them. You see the same thing with being gender non-stereotypical, like personality wise. The core of feminism is you should be able to do whatever you're free to, so long as it's not harming others. Then the slippery slope comes in with something like pronouns, bathrooms. I mean, even cross-dressing. I do think it's strange, and that it makes one a target. Like, I wouldn't do it, not even because, like, when I think of would I wear a dress out in public, I mean, I have an aversion to it, but I think most of the aversion isn't anything about the femininity of the dress itself, that I couldn't be seen in it. I think it's more just a pragmatic, people would look at me weird or make fun of me, and I wouldn't want that. So it would be really hard to do that. That said, if someone was willing to pay those costs, I think that's completely fine. So there's a couple interesting things that happen there. The first is they argue it's not even like you're the rational decision maker, you do a utility cost analysis, and then you just proceed. It's you start to get this desire, well, people shouldn't make fun of me for wearing a dress. Now, that might be true, but also it's just kind of a pragmatic sense of where your culture's at. And then on top of that, because I think even most people, again, they might find it awkward, but I don't think people have like some fundamental moral aversion to others cross-dressing, if so long as, say, they're remaining in their same gender spaces. But when it comes to bathrooms or to pronouns, where then you start to really interfere arguably with others' freedoms, then it gets really, really tricky. And their argument is kind of the same every step along the way. Like, well, why can't I do this if it's just me living my life? Not everyone has to have children. Not everyone has to be gender role conforming. What is the breaking point where it becomes such a political issue?
Yeah, there's a lot in there, a lot to unpack. I mean, maybe we haven't helped ourselves by suggesting that the core of feminism is that you should be able to be gender non-conforming. I mean, that's absolutely part of it. That, a woman can be anything that a woman can be. The fact is, most people are gender conforming. These things are possibly, to a significant, I'm sure to a significant extent, socially mediated, but I think there's also strong reason to think that it's innate to some extent, and that both of these things work together. And I think feminism has to walk this fine line between saying a woman can do anything that a woman is capable of doing. I mean, women can't, impregnate somebody else, or, women are physically less strong than men. So we're not going to be the people who run the fastest 100 meters. We're just not. We have to walk a fine line between saying we should be free to do everything that we're capable of, and saying that a woman who doesn't want to do any of that, but would quite like to have 3 kids, stay home, become very good at baking, whatever, list all your gender stereotypical things you like, that there's something wrong with her making that choice. Like, loads of women want to live like that. Most people want to live quite gender conforming lives because most people are quite conforming. And, they would be in any society where the norms are, relatively accurately matched to what people are like. So we shouldn't be that surprised. We've got rid of a lot of the shitty norms, that women can't be leaders or shouldn't be allowed to vote or aren't clever enough to go to university or whatever. We've got rid of those ones. So what we're left with is, by and large, women like babies better than men do. So it's not that surprising that mostly they're the nursery teachers. Men are stronger than women and physically often more courageous. So they're going to be the firefighters, etc. You get my point. So feminism maybe took a wrong turn to some extent in getting that balancing act right, but it's a really tough balancing act because it's saying that 2 things that are in tension will always be in tension, and that we have to hold both those thoughts in our mind all the time. And people aren't great at that. None of us are great at that. And then comes along the cross-dressing point. So I would have, and I still am to a large extent, been on the, you do you, wear what the hell you like. And I certainly think that's what the law should be. But I now have a better understanding of why some of the men who cross-dress. And, it's not just that it's for erotic purposes, it's that it's deliberately boundary crossing. They're doing it to make people uncomfortable. Like you said, you wouldn't like to go out looking so unusual because it would make you uncomfortable. But there are plenty of men who find that delightful. And those same men, the same impulse to wear, what looks like hooker outfits or little girl outfits or nappies, I think you call them diapers, that same urge is the urge that gets those men wanting to force themselves into women's faces, because it's all the same thing. It's not a straightforward, oh, I'm just more comfortable in a dress, or I think a dress suits me better. It's a sexual thing, and part of that sexual thing is the boundary violation. Does that mean I think you should outlaw cross-dressing? Absolutely not. But there are things that I can say are inappropriate or morally, ethically subpar that are short of illegality.
You heard of these cosplay conventions?
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
furry
It's funny who,
subculture and things like that.
yeah. And, again, I'm not saying it should be illegal. I'm saying it's kink. And there are places that kink is not appropriate. Kink is not appropriate on the street. It's not appropriate in schools. I don't have to celebrate it. It's interesting, the characters that trans women like dressing up as. There's certain favorites. Often it's like very hypersexual superheroes. What's her name? And Harley Quinn, for example. Like, Harley Quinn is crazy and sexy, and she's played by a very beautiful woman, like actually one of the most beautiful actresses imaginable, but she's violent. Like, I look at that and I think, that's an interesting set of traits for a middle-aged man, as I've seen, to want to try to incorporate. It's not a straightforward choice, and it's certainly not that. And then, as you say, then the next thing is you've got to pretend that you don't look at this and think, I'm suspicious, or that's odd, or I'm not going to tell you you can't do this, but not around my kids. They're like, no, you must think of this as just exactly the same as everything else I might be wearing, but it's not the same as everything else that this person might be wearing. And then we're well past the slippery slope. We're into that I have to pretend that I think that this is just part of life's rich tapestry, when actually I think it's a boundary violation, and I want to be able to set my boundaries. Thanks.
Right. Well, regardless of what those social norms end up being, I look at it like this free market exchange where, so long as someone is willing to pay the costs, like, it can harm one's reputation, well, on either end, to be affirming or to be judgmental of these types of things. So long as it's legal, that's all great. At what point does it become a legal problem?
I mean, definitely when you are intruding on other people's actual rights. as opposed to their social costs. So it's a logical proposition. Like the sort of the logical propositions that I say these days are so laughably trivial compared with what I spent 3 years proving for my PhD thesis, that sometimes I think, like, God, I learned all that stuff about geometric measure theory, and here what I'm doing is I'm saying, if there is a man in this space, it can't be women only. Like, that's just a truism. It's not even a logical proposition. So if you think that women should have the right ever to women-only spaces, then we can't have them if men can come into them. And that's a clear line. So if you want to dress up as Harley Quinn or Alice in Wonderland, I will draw inferences about that. And I will feel free to draw those inferences, thank you. I'm not going to stop you from doing it. I'm basically a very liberal person in the sense of 19th century liberalism. But you're not going to come into the women's toilets. You're going to have to go into the men's toilets like that if there isn't a gender neutral option. And if you're willing to do that, fine by me. It's not my problem. That's a men's problem.
This
A
is
lot of
one of
men
the things.
think, sorry, I just finished that thought. A lot of men think that a man who dresses as Alice in Wonderland or Harley Quinn is in danger in the men's toilets. I'm not sure how true that is, but again, it's a problem for women. It's a men's problem. Or they think that man will make all the men very uncomfortable, and I'm sure he will. Again, not a women's problem. So when you say pay the costs have to be paid somewhere that person is appropriate to be, and in the women's spaces is not where that person is appropriate to be.
And this is one of the things that we talked about at ARC, this problem of brain drain. Sometimes I ask myself the same question. I'm doing a whole PhD, arguably around, are people the same gender as their sex, which, depending how you define it, historically, the answer's always been yes. It doesn't even make much sense as a question. And think of what you could be doing years of research on instead. And so much of our public discourse is around such a basic issue. So on one hand, I think, wow, what a waste of time. What if actually that's like a red herring? We ought to just ignore it, focus on more important things. Other times I think, actually, there's nothing more important, because if we can't get something so basic, if we can't achieve consensus on that, how are we going to solve AI alignment, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. It does seem mad that we're doing this. In particular, feminism seemed in a pretty good place in the 1990s. And we went backwards so far, we lost so quickly a lot of things that we were just completely given. Like, it was given that, of course, women needed spaces that men can't be, in particular when women need to recover from sexual violence or protect themselves against sexual violence. And then we lost that, and now we're having to fight it to get it back, which does seem terribly wasteful. I suppose, given that I'm someone who worked for nearly 2 decades at a free market publication, I should understand the idea of creative destruction. And every time anyone says that a planned economy would be less wasteful, it's very wasteful that companies like Nokia went to being the biggest phone company in the world, and then, other ones came along and competed their way up, and Nokia got destroyed and people lost their jobs and so on and so forth. That was Joseph Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction. And it does seem wasteful, but it also maybe seems the only way that we can have real innovation. We lost good things. You have to wonder how we lost them. Were they as good as we thought? Were we defending them properly? Like, maybe we'll be wiser next time round. And then just, shit happens. Like, we keep going to war. You'd think after the First World War that there would have been sense and we wouldn't have had the Second World War. I just feel it's bootless to worry too much about what we could have been doing if we weren't doing this. Because, human beings aren't perfectible. I'm certainly small c conservative enough to think that human nature is flawed and that we are fallen creatures, to use biblical language, even though I'm not a religious person. What else could we be doing? Everything is based on being honest about the truth. Everything that's based on falsehoods is weak, is wrong, is liable to collapse. So unless we're honest about basic facts, we can't build anything. So, the basic facts are all in flux now. We're lying about all sorts of differences between men and women, between gay and straight, between children and adults. That's part of what we've been saying, that people are adultifying children and infantilizing adults. If we don't get straight about what human nature is, then there's no hope for anything. So in a way, it's the best work we could be doing.
I feel like this walking paradox because I believe in objective truth, and yet I also recognize these philosophical conundrums that kind of don't have an objective truth. So, for example, is cereal soup? It's got
Or
all the
cereal soup.
characteristics. There are plenty of internet
Yeah.
memes about things like this. So,
Is a horse a
problems
chair? Yeah.
of family resemblance versus having a classical definition of something. Like the classic philosophical textbook example used to be um, about how to define bachelor, like single, unmarried adult man. Um, Even then, you can think of counterexamples to that, like someone who's, well, never married, but living with a partner long term. They're legally domestic partners, or something like motherhood. Well, what about stepmothers, adoptive mothers, and so on? So you can always come
Hmm.
up with these counterexamples. And even something as basic and obvious as binary sex, when you try to define a precise definition, the best people have done is gametes. And even then, it's almost a little bit circular because gametes are effectively saying genome without any of the intersex variations that would like push you off of the standard sex differentiation pipeline. So then any characteristic that people normally give, and here I start to sound very social constructivist, right? Because I'm not trying to say that sex isn't real because of all these intersex exceptions. At the same time, it's one of these family resemblance problems. Like you have to sort of just use common sense. There's not necessarily a strict boundary. And then because of that, the boundary pushers, you
Mm.
know, and then once you have to enshrine it into law somehow, you're either going to overcorrect or undercorrect. It seemed like it's
Interesting. I mean,
destined to be a
yeah.
mess from the start.
I mean, I don't agree on the sex one, actually. I think sex is the nearest to a true boundary, a true binary in nature.
Hmm.
Um, the meaning obviously comes from the gametes. The reason we say there are two sexes is there are two and only two gametes. That's why there can't be three sexes, because there would have to be three gametes. And most people, it's very uncomplicated because their genome is standard. You know, they have
Hmm.
XY chromosomes and the SRY gene hasn't got transposed onto the X chromosome. But if you say that a female is an individual whose body has traveled down the pathway as far as possible, the developmental pathway that evolved to support the production of female gametes, and has not traveled down the pathway that evolved to support the production of male gametes, then you get in all the intersex conditions except for the few chimerism ones.
Hmm.
So the two, I think you're interested enough in this to go into a lot of detail. The two most difficult sort of paradigmatic intersex conditions are 5-ARD and CAIS. So 5-ARD is 5-alpha reductase syndrome. 5-alpha reductase deficiency, and it's the condition that Castor Semenya has. So this is somebody who is XY, normal levels of testosterone, but cannot metabolize or use dihydrotestosterone. And the only known purposes in the body for dihydrotestosterone are the forming of the male genitalia in utero, and then the growing of body hair in adolescence. So somebody like Castor Semenya is entirely male, except lacking body hair, and was born with abnormal genitalia and got wrongly registered female. And that's why Castor Semenya isn't meant to be competing in women's sports, because as far as everything to do with sports is concerned, that's a male body. And there have been men with 5-ARD who have fathered children. They have internal testes, and they use ICSI, as it's called. And they stick a needle in, they take out some of the sperm, and they inject it into an egg. So that's really a male person, and it's their genes that have made them that way. There's just one little glitch, and then the other male intersex or difference of sex development is complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So that person's insensitive to all of it. Their body tries to go along the female pathway because they can't use testosterone at all. So they grow breasts because the testosterone gets turned into estrogen when they're teenagers. They grow curvy. They don't grow body hair. The voice doesn't break. But they don't have ovaries and they don't produce female gametes. But their body tries to travel along the female developmental pathway. Female meaning the developmental pathway that's evolved to support the production of female gametes. So to me, that is a male DSD. This person is XY. To me, that person is easy enough to classify as female in anything above gamete level,
Hmm.
because their body tried to go along that level and it's bodies that we live with. And then you get left with just chimerism, which is people who have cells from two different individuals. And we've never known of a case of somebody who has chimerism, who is capable of producing both sorts of gametes. So it's usually that they're infertile, or it'll be one. So, I mean, I think you can classify all humans, actually, as male or
Hmm.
female. And that's a neat definition. It's the sort of definition that mathematicians like. Sorry, I like thinking about definitions too. It reminds me very much of the definition of prime number. So you probably have thought, you'd be able to say a prime number is a number that's divisible only by itself and one.
Hmm.
Right? Is one a prime number? Now, it fits that definition, okay? But that mucks up every theorem that you use prime numbers in. So the classic prime number theorem is the one that is the prime factor theorem. It's the one that says that every number can be written as a multiple of primes in one way and only one. So 8 is 2 by 2 by 2. There's no other set of prime numbers that gives you 8 when you multiply them. And you can do that for every number. But if you classify 1 as a prime, you could just keep writing 1 by 1 by 1 by 1 by 1 as many times as you
Hmm.
like. So mathematicians define a prime number as any number except 1 that's divisible by itself and 1. And that's not because it's logically a better definition. It's because it's in terms of how it's used, it's a better definition. The point of defining primes is in order to do mathematics.
Hmm.
So, I mean, we could have classified that CAIS person as male, and there's a good argument for doing so, but it's not useful.
Right.
I mean, it would be useful if you were like trying to decide whether to remove their testes because they might get cancer, or, you're the doctor. But in the world that we live in, it's not useful to classify that person as male. And they're the only male people I know of that it's useful to classify as female. And so then you think like, okay, so how am I going to do the equivalent of divisible by itself and 1, but not 1? And that's my wording for it, that your body travels down the developmental pathway that evolved to support the production of female gametes.
Right. And then when I think of the inverse, this probably wouldn't apply congenitally, but I have this internal double standard for trans men versus trans women.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I have a friend actually, a trans man, female, who's been on testosterone for over a decade. He's a trucker. Like you wouldn't know it. He has a big beard, balding, muscular. Like I have no problem calling this person a man. Now, one of the ways that we connected is through this podcast. He identifies as a red-pilled transsexual, so prefers the term transsexual, which is essentially what's happened, not just transgender, which appeals to some sort of internal gendered soul. So I have a lot of respect for that position, and it makes me think of my own stance on pronouns because I like the idea of, okay, pronouns are only appropriate for one sex, and then it's just clean. You don't have to worry about the exceptions. And then if I look at this, I refer to my trans friend as a man using he pronouns. That means either I've accepted that he's changed sex, and physiologically that's true in most ways, except for genitalia, or I've just created an exception. And then it's something like, well, I use pronouns not particularly based on sex, but like based on sex characteristics or gender role. And then again, you open the door into
Yeah,
all
yeah,
of this
yeah.
type of boundary pushing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, someone was telling me about a philosopher that they talked to who's very sound on all these issues. And, this philosopher is apparently really obsessed with the notion of the passing trans woman. Like, because in effect, what he's saying is that the fully passing trans woman is like a woman who has CAIS, male, but
Hmm.
in every respect seems female. And I mean, the thing is that literally nobody passes in all circumstances of one sex. I mean, your friend is not someone that you're having sex with, I presume. So it's not somebody you got naked with and got up close to their genitals. So, once you do that, no trans person passes. So CAIS, that's true. Their body, right from the beginning, went down that
Right.
pathway. And that means things for their skin, their muscles, whatever brain development is in terms of male or female, literally everything except this very odd situation that they have going on internally. So that person actually can be pretty much fully
Right.
passing. They won't be fully passing when it gets to being a parent because they can't. But, that actually, there really are women who have abnormal development of their uterus or whatever, who can't become parents in a very similar way, in fact. So what would I do about your friend? First, I'd note that trans men pass a lot better than trans women because testosterone's a one-way street. So it doesn't really arise, the passing trans woman. Like, I'm always amazed when I see people think that a particular trans woman passes. And often it's a man who thinks that this person passes. I think men's perception of sex might be worse than women's, and there's good evolutionary reason why that might be the case. I also think that a lot of men, they're just like, has tits, that'll do. They're just not going very deep. Or they think close enough, Or there's proper human beings who are full proper men, and then there's secondary human beings where you put the rubbish along with the women. Like, I just think it's a very sexist way that men think about whether a man passes as a woman or not. Of course, they've got a skin in the game as well. Like, it's not like the trans woman is causing them any difficulties. It's causing us difficulties. So then back to your trans man friend. There are some well-known trans men here in England that I do forget. I end up saying he. And then I think, like, why would I be such a knob as to insist on calling this person she? And the reason for the particular trans man I'm talking about is that this is a woman who has dedicated her life to destroying women's rights. Like, she has spent decades working for the destruction of sex-based categories. And there's no way to explain why a man would do that if this person really was a man. Knowing that this person is a woman who hates being a woman and wants to force everybody to treat her as if she's a man is crucial to understanding this woman's entire career. So I'm not going to do it. I'm going to say this is a woman because that's the only way I can explain the way that person behaves. And it's the same with some of the trans women as well. And there's a particular trans woman who doesn't remotely pass, India Willoughby, who likes to say that I'm frumpish and that I was always complaining about my shoes and how old I look, and that I'm jealous of trans women, and that's why I hate trans women, because I'm so frumpy and they're so beautiful. You're like, you sound really like a man. This is real misogynistic talk. And it doesn't make sense. The way this man is behaving doesn't make sense if I think of this person as a woman. It makes painful and total sense if I remember that they're a man. And that can work the other way around too.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm like this philosopher who's obsessed with the passability piece because it seems like we've already introduced a practical exception with males with CAIS. And I don't know if the female who's been on testosterone for a long, long time is that different. You mentioned genitalia, so that's the way they ultimately don't pass. I guess you could introduce surgeries, and you could also
but remember,
introduce.
genitalia is not nothing here, by the way.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know what your friend does here, but an awful lot of trans men regard themselves as gay men and think that it's their right to go into gay men's spaces. And I mean, that's a huge boundary violation and completely wrong on their part. And sexuality and sex are not a small part of human life. So if somebody doesn't pass in sex, then they don't pass.
Right. But then I'm thinking about people who are, let's say just biologically completely one sex, and then there's a freak accident later in life. A man loses his penis. He doesn't lose his manhood. So I
Exactly.
are why are those different? I mean, unless you
From
have some sort of
CAIS.
essential, or from the female who's masculinized in every respect except
Because
genitalia.
nobody's masculinized or feminized in every respect. Like, it's a false standard. It's literally not possible. You can't turn back time. You can't unscramble an egg. Somebody who went through female development, even just in utero, by the way, loads of things are different in utero. Baby boys are born half a pound heavier. They're born more active. They're born more rigid. They behave differently. Like, and this is back to, feminism, the type of feminism that pretends this isn't true. It is true. We know that. And if you have to be denying the truth to deny it. So somebody who's already been through even just the wash of hormones in the uterus, let alone the one at puberty, they're never going to be fully turned into the other sex, even skipping just the genitals. You can't do it. the CAIS person is not like that. The CAIS person has gone along the other developmental pathway as far as that is possible. Their brain, their skin, their bones, their muscles, their your circulatory system, all of those things have gone down a pathway as best as possible. That's the other sex's pathway, the female pathway. And that is nothing like a man who has had a whole bunch of facial surgery and all the rest.
I'm still trying to form my beliefs around this, and I hope it's not frustrating to you. I hope I don't
Not at
sound
all.
too
This
woke.
took me years. I mean, I hope it's maybe helpful to think about the prime number example, because I don't think that CAIS is being treated as a real, genuine exception in that. I think they're being treated like the except one.
Right.
They're being treated as the little clause that stops you from having to annoyingly say except for CAIS every time. I mean,
So,
CAIS in sport is an interesting one because they're overrepresented. And it appears that, for example, they're taller. They're on average much taller than women, like XX women. So there's obviously things that are sex linked that aren't on the Y chromosome and that don't require testosterone. So you could argue, and I mean, some people would, and I couldn't tell them that they're wrong. You could argue that they don't belong in women's sports. They clearly don't belong in men's sports either, and that's not a good enough reason. But I'm just saying they don't. They haven't been through male puberty. Like, they really haven't, and that's like 90% of the male advantage. It's not all of it, but it's 90% of it. So they are a genuine question, and I'm not saying that my answer of looking at the developmental pathway rather than the genes, rather than the chromosomes, is the right answer, but I think it's the most elegant way of getting pretty much everybody classified correctly.
I do think it's more elegant textbook wise. I don't think it helps me just in those social interactions, like, because then you
Sure.
have these rare exceptions with people who have been on hormones, and then for sake of philosophical consistency, you kind of go against what's intuitive. So what I've been playing
Yeah, but we
around
do
with.
that all the time. We do that all the time in social affairs, you know?
Mhm.
I mean, would you, when it comes to all these personal issues of, say, somebody who's adopted, I have adopted friends who would say that their adopted parents are their real parents. They hate that expression, real parents, They would say maybe
Right.
genetic parents because the real parents are the people who brought them up. I completely agree with that. But then there's other people who feel differently about it.
Mhm.
And I'd be happy enough to go along with whatever that person felt was the right thing to do because, it's no skin off my nose and it's a very considerable amount of skin off their nose.
Mhm.
So consistency is slightly overrated in social interactions, I would say.
Mhm. So what I've been playing around with is that puberty is more so the linchpin than the earlier going down the pipeline of towards one sex or the other. And I know that ignores the prenatal effects that are important, and also the chromosomal effects like we're talking about. But when I think of what is my internal radar for what passes or not, it's basically based on puberty secondary sex characteristics. Now, I've also met a male who was one of the first in the United States to go on puberty blockers, never went through male puberty, started taking estrogen, so was passable in every way. And I didn't know. So then I really was asking myself, okay, either I have to accept this is a woman with a penis, or I am going to go out of my way to use male pronouns and potentially piss this person off when it actually didn't make me uncomfortable. What I realized is that the not passing is the thing that makes me uncomfortable. So I guess there's a couple ways to define that. It would either be it's pronoun use is based on passability, so it's like a perceptual thing, or it's just based on puberty. But in either case, especially if I were to imagine that this male who never went through male puberty, if they also received a vaginoplasty, I know there's also other sorts of problems with that, and it wouldn't actually be as functional, but all things considered, if a man could never tell, even if you're walking into the bedroom and hypothetically you could never tell, and the trans woman who'd never went through male puberty also didn't tell him, then I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've got to an edge case, and I would push back on it. So one reason that I would be very determined to classify this person as a man is that what's happened to him is a human rights atrocity. That person was blocked from going through the evolved pathway that turns children into adults. And with unknown consequences, but probably dire in many respects. And we won't know until we start seeing those people, whether they get Alzheimer's early. That person had the choice to have normal sexual function and perhaps to become a parent taken away from him when he was a child. And denying that he is a boy is denying that what happened to him was a medical atrocity, and I'm not willing to do that. I also know a few puberty blocked young people, not personally, but at close secondhand, like friends or relatives know them. And it's interesting, like one of them isn't passable and was definitely puberty blocked properly, really young, and put, I think, 12, and then put on estrogen at 14, and yet has a surprising degree of male features. In particular, narrower, deeper, smaller eyes and, lower eyebrows. It's the eyes that are the most hard to change. Like even when people get the jaw done or whatever. And very tall as well, by the way. And I'm like, okay, so you can do that to somebody and they still don't pass, even leaving outside the sexual organs. And then the two others that I know at close second hand are both, let's say, sexually in a very difficult place. Like they've had the process. I mean, I think both of them, I would guess, would have been gay men. They were really notably effeminate little boys, and both of them think this too. They both think they would have grown up to be gay men, and one of them wishes that had been allowed to happen. They both of them do quite BDSM type things, and neither of them really understands what their sexuality is, and neither of them feels that they can make what would be a normal adult close relationship. And, if you look at the kids, the trans kids from the mid 2010s, some of them are working on OnlyFans. And I get the same sense that these are people who have difficulty with adult intimacy. And that's not surprising when you think that they've had their puberty blocked. They haven't had the chance to discover what their own sexuality is and to grow into themselves as fully functioning adult human beings, sexual beings. But they're still human. They still want human connection. They still want to feel things. And so I think they go for more extreme or painful, maybe, ways to do it. And I just don't think that saying that that's just a woman cuts it. And then lastly, I would say this thing about what if a man can't tell? I'm sorry. If you haven't rooted around to the extent that you can tell the difference between actual female genitals and something that could be made out of the skin of a penis and testicles, then something is badly wrong. These are just very different. I've tried to find a way to say this that might make it to some sort of safe for work forum. And the best example I could come up with was if you imagine that somebody was born without a tongue and that you decided you were going to try to make a tongue for them out of some other part of their body, for example, their forearm or their thigh. And you list all the ways in which tongues are just different than the flesh from the forearm or thigh. In particular, your tongue is wet for the whole of your life. And yet it doesn't do what wet skin does, which is to break up, because it's a different sort of skin. It's got muscles right through it. It can curl different ways. It's hypersensitive. It's got a load of nerve endings. It's capable of tasting things. And you're going to put a flap of flesh from somebody's thigh in someone's mouth and then say, see, it bruises. It's like a tongue. You can't tell the difference. No, sorry. You cannot make anything remotely like a woman's vagina that can pass a baby's head through it, that's capable of a certain sort of action in orgasm, that can keep itself clean and moist for an entire lifetime without breaking down. You can't make that out of a man's penis and scrotal skin.
Well, my sense is that a small fraction of these cases might be genuine edge cases, like these intersex conditions we've talked about. A small fraction are genuinely bad actors with some sort of kink or trying to do some sort of boundary pushing. I think the athletes would also be included in this. And the majority are confused and experiencing some sort of body dysmorphia, particularly the minors, teenagers, particularly teenage girls. And my pragmatic sense is that even though I think I have more openness to those edge cases. Like I think the rigid definitions make me less comfortable. I think, well, the more we keep the door open, the more that vast majority of the the middle who are just confused, the more likely they are to be confused. And if we can't quickly resolve this, then it's going to seem more like a sensible option than it actually
Yes.
is. I think I have, one could argue, too much sympathy for that very minority exception case. And intersex has been fascinating to me, even though, well, I've heard that intersex people themselves are often frustrated by being dragged in, particularly by the trans activists who are almost using them as justification to undermine definitions of biological sex, when in reality, many people would just identify as I am male or I am female with a DSD.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that there are very occasional people who were wrongly classified at birth or who make you think hard about your definitions doesn't say anything about people who weren't wrongly classified at birth or for whom they fit directly in the definition. And I mean, some DSDs, as you know, come with very significant health challenges. So they have to be identified, and those people will need treatment. And it's quite horrible to imagine using them in this instrumentalized way for other people's identity demands. I think a lot of the teenagers in particular definitely are, not just, it's more than confused, it's they're misled. A lot of them wouldn't have been gender dysphoric at all if there wasn't this particular discourse. Gender
Mhm,
dysphoria used to be rare, and it used to be rare at a time, by the way, that it was more awkward to be a girl in many respects.
mhm,
Like girls were more constrained, and yet very few girls thought to themselves, "Oh, I'm really a boy." I mean, they might have thought, like, I wish that people would let me do the things that the boys are allowed to do. But that's a very sensible thing to wish and drives you towards trying to liberate women. So we've created gender dysphoria by putting that idea into people's heads, and it comes back to the ruminating and the encouragement to mental dis-ease in schools and in universities and online. And I really feel that those kids are being used as facts on the ground. Um, they're the kids who are going to need support and consideration and specialist mental and physical healthcare right through their lives, every one of them, one way or another. And the more of them there are, the harder it is to just go back to saying sex is sex, this space is for women, this space is for men. If that doesn't suit you, we'll try and arrange a third option everywhere there's space for it. But, you know, like in particular, every trans man is going to be a difficulty. Even I mean, I have by now quite a few friends who've detransitioned, and the women who've detransitioned just have great difficulty for the rest of their lives because, they might have a deep voice, they look masculine, they sound masculine, like they cause some of the same distress in women-only spaces as a man would. But I mean, they are women, and they may feel they don't belong in men's spaces. They're intruding on men's spaces for privacy reasons. They may well not be safe in men's spaces. Every one of those people is a difficulty for just organizing things back the way that used to be by sex when that was
mhm.
sensible. And I think that's something that the trans lobby likes. I think they like as many possible innocent collateral damage
Mhm.
that, because I mean, these bad actors, it's easy to be unsympathetic to them. And I think among the adult men, there are quite a lot of bad actors. But the kids, no, they're not bad actors. They were subjected to,
Mhm.
a cultish indoctrination process, and in some cases, a medical atrocity. And we owe them our consideration as best we can, but it's hard to know what to do.
Now, in my dissertation research, I don't have access to clinical gender dysphoria data. That was actually my initial plan. I reached out to some of the gender clinics and these high-profile gender-affirming psychiatrists, basically offering to do an adversarial collaboration. Uh, they were not surprisingly very closed off to that idea. So I'm more interested now in this social transition phenomenon. And I don't necessarily even mean cross-dressing in kids. I mean particularly teenage girls who, in all other respects, are feminine or just tomboys, but they identify as non-binary with no obvious alteration in anything else. And often it's just a phase. So on one hand, I look at that and I think this is a major risk factor for this harmful medicalization pathway. So the more children that do that, the more are going to transition. So that's overall a bad thing. On the other hand, I think, what does it matter? Like it's kind of strange to me if a tomboy wants to not call herself that, but you know, culture changes, language changes, maybe non-binary is just a stand-in for gender non-stereotypical. And the people that I've talked to, that's basically what they say, uh, particularly young women. They say they're non-binary because they don't feel particularly feminine and they don't want to like reinforce this gender binary. Uh, and ironically, I'll say it seems like if you exclude yourself from the category of woman because you're not particularly feminine, then you leave behind the remaining women as more feminine and you reinforce the stereotype as opposed to like boldly claiming your womanhood and your non-femininity.
Absolutely. And I mean, what they're saying is, I mean, I've come to think of non-binary as not like the other girls.
Mhm.
You know, they're saying girls are tedious, boring, doormats, you know, destined to grow up to sort socks and wipe arses. And they're the special type of human being who's better and more important than that. And that could possibly be a woman. Like, you know, women are the inferior second sex, is what they're saying. But they're not the second sex. They're the actors in their own lives. They're the lead actors. And a woman couldn't be a lead actor. So I can't think of anything more sexist than that, actually. However, listen, the world is full of sexists. I can't fix them all. So if they want to say that and they don't cause major difficulties for people, hopefully don't medicalize, and so on, you know, I can't fix everything. I can't, and this isn't the worst thing. What I object to is any sort of encouragement or official accommodation for this. Like, what I would like is schools and governments and so on to say, that's nice, dear, I don't care. The same way
Mhm.
that they would say about anything else. Like, if the kid comes in and says, you know, I'm a goth now, miss, like, great, fine. You're still subject to the uniform rules. Do what you like at
Mhm.
home with your friends and at the weekend. That's what I would like. And then it could actually be more playful and fun. And I mean, you know, at some I know a lot of people whose children have gone through this by now. And I mean, it's extremely upsetting for parents because a lot of it is about controlling your parents, like I said. Like, a lot of it is about telling them that, telling in particular your mother, like, girls love telling their mothers that their mothers are boring past it, because girls like to think that they're not going to grow up to be like their mothers. You know, middle-aged women are so the most boring human beings in the world, especially if they're white. Nobody wants to grow up to be that. So when you feel like a special, unique, stunning individual who couldn't possibly be a supporting actress, you've got your mother, and it's your mother you don't want to be. So telling her that she's past it and her idea of feminism is passé and she's got it all wrong and you are a they, them, or whatever, it's just a great power play. But, you know, teenage girls do power plays against their mothers. It's not out of ordinary for that. But then, you know, what several of those women have told me is that at some point their daughter thinks, oh, this is very sexist, actually. And then they
Mhm.
stop. So you know, if we could just hold it lightly and not try and embed it or reinforce it in school, hold boundaries for them and let them come to that decision themselves, that'd be great. There's another risk. Like you said, that it does increase the risk of medicalization. It absolutely does. But it also increases the risk that those children behave, those young people behave dangerously socially. So I caught up with a friend recently who's, I think it's her, I can't remember if it's her sister or her husband's sister, has a daughter who has a mild learning difficulty, like mild, but, you know, significant learning difficulty, and had been identifying as non-binary or transmasc or trans boy, trans man, like, for several years. People tend to go in and out of where they see themselves on that spectrum. And it had led her to some quite risky behaviours, like using men's toilets in pubs and so on. She's not medicalised at all. She's clearly a girl. I think she was probably binding her breasts, which is itself a risk factor. And then she came to the attention of some predatory older men who now look out for women who identify as non-binary or trans men as teenagers, because they know those girls are easy prey, because those girls are not thinking through their vulnerabilities as women and as girls,
Mhm.
and they can be easily tempted into risky behavior and risky situations by anyone who acts as if they believe that they're boys. And in fact, this poor girl had got raped. Um, yeah. and actually had stopped identifying as a man, after that. Like, it's a very, very painful way to learn that lesson. So yeah, when girls dissociate from the physical reality of being female, they automatically put themselves at significant extra risk, and they are automatically obvious to people who want to predate on them. And by now, there's a fairly organized movement of predatory men to recognize those girls as a specific type of vulnerable.
Hmm. What would you do for females who had taken testosterone for a long time, masculinized, even if they ultimately detransition and want to identify as women and return to women's spaces? Now you would have women seeing them, for all they know, a man trying to enter. And then it's almost like it would create this new loophole of now you could have men pretending to be detransitioned women. Like, would there have to be some sort of legal protection, a special badge? Like, all of that sounds
Mm.
so scary.
Yeah, we're nowhere near really trying to think this through. But remember, in a lot of spaces, people around them will know. Like, this is another thing about the passing trans woman. Like, I don't think, what's his name? Your senator, is Sarah McBride. Is that the right name?
In
Your,
Massachusetts.
yeah, is that right? That's the right name, isn't it? The man who identifies as a woman who's in
Oh, I
Congress.
don't know.
Yeah, I think it is. I don't think he passes. But anyway, suppose he passed perfectly. Everybody knows he's a man because he's famous. So if he goes into women's spaces, women know there's a man in the space, even if that person passes perfectly. And trans men, like desisted trans men, will be the reverse of that in lots of spaces. People know them. They know that they're women. So, among the many detransitioners I know who have masculinized very significantly, I know that they're women. So why would I mind them being in my space, even if they look like men? Because I know them. But if they're going to go into a public space where they're not known, they're going to get women saying, "You shouldn't be in this space." And that's one of the reasons I want us to stop doing this thing of medically transitioning young people who are likely to detransition, because that person is now constantly, permanently, and unavoidably in a very difficult position for them. We
Hmm.
can't just say you can't challenge anyone in public spaces because it might be a detransitioner, because as you say, it might not be.
And how often does that happen? My sense is that even the types of women that are uncomfortable probably wouldn't speak up, even if it was a trans woman who is obviously a man. Maybe because they don't want to be labeled transphobic, maybe because they're just scared for their safety, maybe because they think it's just not worth the confrontation.
It just depends where you are again. Like, people tend to just think of one place when they say toilet. I think they tend to think of something like in a shopping mall,
Hmm.
high throughput, never see the same people twice. In a space like that, no, you're not going to challenge a man. I mean, a man who's willing to come into a women only space is by definition a bad man. He's willing to overstep women's boundaries. That's precisely the sort of man you do not want to challenge in a confined space. But loads of toilets or other sorts of places, they're a bit semi-managed. They're in your workplace, they're in your university, they're in a school, they're in a hospital. In places like that, you have the opportunity of going and saying, there's somebody I'm a bit worried about in the toilet. You can find somebody much more easily. I mean, an obvious one would be a gym. And also a lot of ones, you need a badge of some sort to get in. So in my gym, the when you register, it asks whether you're male or female, and your card only gives you access to the relevant toilets and changing rooms. Now,
Wow.
I think they ask whether you identify as male or female, so that's a second problem. But my point there is that if you see somebody who looks like a man in a space like that, you could go and talk to somebody, and then they could say, it's really okay. Like, in a perfect world, they could say, it's really okay. There really are no male people allowed into your toilet, I promise you. And then you would understand that this is a woman and it's fine.
Hmm.
Um, I think when people talk about toilets, they should always remember toilets in nightclubs and pubs, which are very dangerous places where quite a lot of rapes do happen.
Hmm.
So because people are drunk, because that's where predatory men do their thing. There's a cubicle, you can push a woman into it. And even the single cubicle toilet arrangements are totally unsuitable for pubs and nightclubs because they always have the floor to ceiling door. A man can hang around outside them. A young woman who looks inebriated comes in, shove her in, close the door behind, So it's not one thing. A public toilet isn't one thing. There's lots of different situations. But yeah, so long way round to say that trans men are going to be a specific tough problem for us to accommodate in public facilities, like really for the rest of their lives, because they're not safe in the men's. They shouldn't be using it. But they will raise concerns in at least some female facilities, and we have to be able to say so.
I think one of the reasons it's been so hard to consider treating gender dysphoria, particularly in children, is because it's tied in with this messy history of conversion therapy. And if you believe there's such a thing as transgender people in general, no matter how rare, it's hard to tell at what point are you practicing conversion therapy and at what point are you just helping the vast majority of people experiencing dysphoria out of it. And I think I do still lean towards being trans exists insofar as some minority of people might actually prefer to live their lives that way. And if they're adults, I guess I take this libertarian stance of even if they want to have surgery and hormones, I think it's net harmful. I worry about their future. They're also going to have all these social difficulties, but all things considered, I think if they're willing to make an informed decision about that, well, they should. I don't know what to do with the edge cases, like legally, what would you do about the toilets, for example? And then even then, well, an 18-year-old is an adult, and many of these kids with gender dysphoria are just going to be waiting for their 18th birthday. So
Yeah.
I don't like the libertarian idea that still keeps that door open. I also don't like the idea of it should be illegal. I don't know what to do about that. What do you think?
I think that they get missold. Like, yeah, I'm willing to accept that there are probably some adults who would be happier if they could go through this surgery and then be accepted as members of the opposite sex. I think it's probably a very small number if you're not trying to suggest sell gender dysphoria, but I think there'll be people like that. The thing is, they can't. They can't become the opposite sex, and that matters for other people. So if you were to say to somebody like that, you would be happier. Like, suppose I have a crystal ball, I can tell which people they are. You're a person who would be happier if we do all these surgeries and then lie to everybody else that you've changed sex and then force them all to accept that in places like toilets and so on. The thing is, I can't do the second bit of it. I can't ever make a man into someone that women must accept in changing rooms, sports, rape crisis centres, for a medical exam, an intimate medical exam, whatever. I can't do it. So if we were to say to those people, we can do this surgery on you, but we're not going to change your documents. If people knew you beforehand and they still call you a man, we're not going to sanction them, legally. You still can't use the women's toilets at work or anywhere else. If you want to play sport, you're going to be playing sport in the men's. If we said all of that, like, how many people would still go through it? Because we don't know that, because literally since the very first doctor who did this, part of what they promised was women will accept you as a woman. They gave them letters. They gave them letters telling them, show this letter in the public toilet if a woman challenges you. So then it would be something like, those occasional people who get unbelievably extreme facial tattoos and do things like get a fork in their tongues or get their ears cut off and say that they're snakes or something like that. I mean,
They get judged.
They get judged. They don't get jobs. Nobody has to say, yes, you really are a snake. I mean, I was just thinking, I was trying to think about this as an example the other day. And I remembered some case that I'd read about in the papers here of some woman who had, like, it's obviously an addiction. Like, I don't think any moral doctor should be feeding this, but she had really tattooed all over her face and her head. Like, she'd shaved her head and she just had all these crazy, very demonic type tattoos. They were upside down crosses and things on her face. So I Googled, and up came hundreds of stories. There's hundreds of people who've tattooed all over their faces. And then the story is, you can't get a job. So it would turn into that. And then, yes, there would still be some people who did it, because there's still some people who get tattoos all over their face. Yeah. But I mean, it would just then be, like you don't get this done very easily in the UK, because in this country, there isn't the same large for-profit, inverted commas, healthcare sector. It wouldn't be done on the NHS. Like, anyone who did an actual cost-benefit analysis of any of those surgeries would not be doing them on the NHS. And the NHS is meant to do all these cost-benefit analyses. There's a whole institute dedicated to it. The NHS is not meant to offer anything that doesn't meet the standards for producing QALYs, as they call them, quality adjusted life years. And they have not done that. And in fact, whenever they've done it, they did it on cross-sex hormones and on puberty blockers. And it didn't come out. It didn't come out that they should be done, and they kept doing it. Phalloplasties, there's no way phalloplasties would reach the quality standard for public funding here.
Hmm. Yeah. That's sort of allow it, but don't affirm it and don't expect society to
Yeah,
affirm it
you're
either.
not going, no one's going to play along with it, same way as they don't play along with it if you pretend you're a snake.
Yeah. I guess that's the best I can come up with. Helen, I want to close asking your advice for other people like myself or even more undecided than myself who maybe don't have so much skin in the game. They generally want to be respectful when they encounter these edge cases. They don't want to be rude and use someone's non-preferred pronouns. They're also uncomfortable at the thought of doing it. Maybe they go along with it anyway, just to err on the side of not getting bullied. I think that's the vast majority of people who have a more common sense understanding of sex differences and are just scared. I think the tide is turning, that people are speaking up more and looking for pragmatic solutions. But what do you say to the average person who wants to make it better?
Yeah. I mean, I can't tell anyone else to blow up their lives for a principle. But you have to understand that if you call a man a woman, 99 times out of 100, that man is going to take that as you agreeing with him using women's spaces and doing things that only women are meant to do. He just will. That is the deal. That is what they're told by their activists is their right. So if you want to say to a man, you seem like a nice chap. You do you. Where would you like? But you're a man. That's the only way you can actually say, and don't come into the toilets with me. You're not welcome. It's not okay. That's a boundary violation. But I'm not the one who's at university. I mean, I know loads of you. I mean, I was at this event on Wednesday and a bunch of university students came and, all of them, the ostracization they've experienced, the not just borderline, the actual bullying that they've experienced from other students and from academics. And I mean, these are all people who are willing to use people's preferred pronouns. They're just not willing to say that trans women are women as a theoretical, fact. So I'm not the one who has to try and live in that environment. Everybody knows what I think, and I'm older, so I can't say that somebody should go along with it, but know what you're doing. What you're doing is you're saying that they can insist that they can destroy everything that women need men to stay out of. All these rights that we have been won by disagreeable people who are willing to make a point that most people would think seems trivial. Like, why did Rosa Parks not sit where she was allowed to sit? It was a principle. It was a seat on a bus, What about the guys who won? It's funnily enough, it's cake icing, both on this side of the Atlantic and in America. What about these guys who weren't willing to bake the cake? These are the people who protect free speech and won rights for all of us, because they were willing to stand on a principle. And it's okay if you're not willing to. Most people aren't. But
The thing
just
that's so
recognize that
sad,
you're leaving
that
it to other people.
many of these trans people think that they're Rosa Parks in standing up,
I
even
know.
if they do it in a bullying way.
Yeah, I know, because they're lied to by their activists. They're encouraged to be. I mean, they're bullies who think of themselves as social justice heroes. And, they're not even bad people. They've been made bad by the ideology. But what they're doing is bad. If you're a man and you come into spaces if there's a sign on the door that says female and you're male, you're not welcome in there. Doesn't matter what games you play to yourself to say, oh, I'm really female, I'm an edge case, I pass. You are doing a bad thing. But at the moment, anyone who tells you you're doing a bad thing has to be extraordinarily brave and also quite bloody-minded. It's no mistake. It's no coincidence that it's usually people who are religious who take these cases, because most people are more pragmatic. Most people think to themselves, this is going to be so much grief. Why me? Why do I have to do this? But if you think your immortal soul is on the line here and that God chose you as an instrument, then you may do it. And I mean, I'm an atheist. I'm just recognizing that there's a reason why free speech for all of us the boundary of free speech has been set by conservative Christians because they're the people who are willing to stand at the absolute edge case, which was, are you willing to ice a cake that says a message that you think will damage your immortal soul? And by doing that, they protected free speech for absolutely everybody. And it's okay if you're not that hero. Most of us aren't. But just recognize that every time you play along with somebody else's lies about their sex, you are helping those people to think that you're okay with it.
Thank you so much for your time, Helen.
Oh, thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me on. I enjoyed the conversation a lot.